In this chapter, the authors discuss the relevance of theory, what it is, and why it is useful for strategic communication practitioners. They then define and discuss persuasion theory and examine the processes and characteristics of persuasion. They conclude by identifying the three models of persuasion: extended parallel process, elaboration likelihood, and social judgment. What is theory? A theory is a systematic explanation or description of some phenomenon. Everyday efforts to theorize about events that occur establishes a sense of order, knowing, and predictability. Personal past experience, such as our own or someone else's, mental shortcuts or rules of thumb for common situations, customs and traditions, religious beliefs, popular culture, observations of other people, the advice of experts, our intuition, and even social media and internet content can all serve as frameworks for educated guesses about day-to-day phenomena. The mental shortcuts are known as heuristics. An over-reliance on heuristics can lead to subjective, biased thinking that represents a limited and limiting view of the world. In contrast, scholarly theories are the result of a much more rigorous process of development, inquiry, and testing than everyday ways of knowing. Scholarly theories represent systematic frameworks for approaching situations. They represent a more solid basis for strategic communication because they are evidence-based, the result of rigorous inquiry and research. Scholarly theories are the result of a five-step process of inquiry. First, asking questions about phenomena. Second, hypothesizing the relationships among variables of interest based on what prior research has already revealed about the concepts involved. 3. Systematically observing the phenomenon of interest using valid research methods. Fourth, testing, and finally revising or altering the original theory based on the results of the test. Thus, a refined definition for formal scholarly theory was provided by West and Turner in such a way: a system of concepts with indications of the relationships among these concepts that help us to understand a phenomenon. Therefore, theories enable their users to describe, explain, predict, and control the concepts under consideration. Persuasion is an activity that involves symbolic communication between two or more persons with the intent to change attitudes, beliefs, and/or behaviors of the receivers. Although the primary goal of any persuasive message is to advocate some type of change among the audience, strategic communicators operate with one or more specific goals in mind, that is, to change how listeners feel or act. These goals are interrelated and often based on what audience members believe. Organizations often have strategic informational goals. Information influences audience members' beliefs or perceptions of the truth or existence or falsity of something. The authors differentiate between informational goals and persuasive goals. Attitudes refer to our consistent feelings of like or dislike toward a particular object, person, concept, or idea. In terms of persuasion, people can unlearn their attitudes when they are effectively influenced. Some persuasive messages are aimed at altering audience behavior or overt physical action. Messages or campaigns with the goal of influencing behavior encourage specific, explicit behavioral activities. Sometimes when the persuasive goal is behavioral change, the best we can hope for is that audience members will commit to taking action or behaving in a particular way. This commitment is known as behavioral intention, or an individual's expectation or plan that he or she will behave in some particular way. However, there is the human tendency to resist change goals of persuasion. Psychological reactance theory posits that persuasive messages threaten an audience's feeling of freedom to think, believe, and act as they wish. This threat is one of the primary explanations for why people resist influence messages. Scholarly tradition relevant to audience resistance to persuasion suggests that a growing number of people are rejecting consumerism and embracing simplicity and minimalism in their lives. This is referred to as the postmodern perspective, a complex ideological or rather a complex ideology characterized by skepticism about and often rejection of scientific claims, traditional power structures, and common or traditional beliefs or behaviors. Now, this perspective on consumer resistance poses unique challenges to strategic communicators and emphasizes the importance of knowing your audience as well as societal or cultural beliefs and trends about your message. So how do we evaluate a persuasive message audience? Well, to determine what a particular type of listener will consider sufficient and credible, you will need to know which of the following three audiences you are about to address. The first type will be an audience that agrees with a position. For this type of audience, persuasive messages that reinforce a receiver's present position on an issue are the easiest type to develop. Strategies to intensify the support of an already supportive audience include establishing common ground, providing your audience with some motivation and encouragement to strengthen their agreement, and to be straightforward. The second type of audience is an audience that disagrees with your position. These are the most challenging audiences to influence. Suggestions for preparing messages for this type of audience include messages should advocate for just small amounts of change when the audience's position is far from the one they are advocating. Next, establish some common ground, which is similar to the first type of audience. Give resistant audience plenty of credible evidence that there are problems with the status quo, which is the way things are currently. Now finally, the third type of audience will be an audience that's neutral or ambivalent. The task should be to shape the audience's attitudes and behaviors. Communicators should still establish why they should decide, explain your position and why you have adopted it. Establish common ground and similarity with your audience. Source credibility refers to an audience's perception that the message source has expertise, is believable, and cares about the audience's best interests. In order to be persuasive, strategic messages must incorporate cues that invoke the message source's credibility. Research suggests that the credibility of a particular message is likely to have more long-term influence on an audience than any positive feelings the audience might have had about the source prior to the message. The sleeper effect or idea that receivers exposed to low credibility sources developed more positive attitudes over time, and those exposed to high credibility sources will weaken in their feelings of positivity toward that source over time. The discounting model was developed as a probable explanation for why the sleeper effect occurs. Source credibility effects on message recipients are typically temporary. Strategies for building source credibility include emphasis or to emphasize source credibility early and prominently in the message and/or campaign. Find ways to remind the audience of how the message source is, or rather who the message source is, and why they should believe that source to be expert, trustworthy, and caring. Also, encourage transparent, positive online reviews of your brand. Arrange for supportive introductions from sources that your audience will find highly credible when interacting with the audience face-to-face. Ensure that all visual and written materials are consistent with your organization's style guide or the style guide for this particular brand or project. Communicate ethically, and what that means is to be objective, accurate, and transparent. Rely on two-sided messages with refutation wherever possible to maintain your credibility and the integrity of a message. A two-sided message involves articulating your position or making your request and acknowledging why the audience might not agree or might not want to comply. Present messages strategically by using language that is relevant and will be understood by your audience. Pay special attention to message organization. Be sure that the content of your message is highly receiver-centered in order to maintain credibility. When working on social media platforms, balance self-promoting messages with ones your readers will find useful or entertaining, and never resort to clickbait. Clickbait is a pejorative term that refers to sensational, provocative online content shared with the intent of arousing reader interest and drawing them to your website in order to generate traffic or online advertising revenue. And finally, proofread and edit all written communication carefully. Appeals refer to the evidence-based strategies that a strategic communicator uses within a single message or larger campaign to ethically compel and influence the target audience. There are two primary categories. First, logical appeals. Such appeals rooted in reason and logic rely heavily on facts, data, statistical evidence, or the conclusions of known high-status experts. They are useful because they allow the message source to make powerful claims that something is true to a certain percentage of the time or under certain conditions. The next form of appeals is the emotional appeals. This second type of appeal involves the use of strategies that arouse the target audience's emotions. Fear, guilt, excitement, happiness, anxiety, or regret all represent examples of the kinds of emotional reactions people have to experiences, words, phrases, and messages. Many emotional appeals are made in the form of a narrative, which are stories. The most common forms of emotional appeals include humor. Humor involves a range of strategies designed to amuse an audience and can be a highly influential emotional appeal. However, it's a difficult emotional appeal to use effectively. Another common form of emotional appeal is guilt. Guilt is a negative reaction that persuaders often shaped through message strategies to strategically motivate action within the target audience. Similarly, like humor, it is a risky strategy for a strategic communicator to use. There are more than one theory that can explain the same phenomenon, which is why what some prominent theories of persuasion for strategic communication are telling us. We'll consider 3 such theories in this chapter. The first one is the extended parallel process model. Fear is probably the most widely researched of all emotional appeals. The extended parallel process model, or EPPM, was developed to provide a more comprehensive understanding of fear and when and how it works as a persuasive tool. Researchers found that while a message might effectively create fearful feelings in receivers, that fear did not necessarily lead the audience to engage in the behavior the source was advocating. Researchers theorized that in order to create a behavioral change, a fear appeal must also include a recommendation for how to deter the threat implied in the fear appeal. There are 2 responses. First, fear control. It occurs as negotiations between ourselves. Second, danger control, which occurs when the fear appeal successfully results in receivers assessing the threat and taking steps to eliminate it. There are 4 components of an effective fear appeal: severity, susceptibility, response efficacy, and self-efficacy. EPPM gives strategic communicators a clear map for using fear in a way that will lead to lasting behavioral change, rather than superficial receiver efforts to manage their fears. Next, let's look at Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM. Elaboration refers to the amount of conscious thought or scrutiny that a receiver applies to a message. ELM is a powerful theory because it provides insight into why people elaborate on messages or do not. It indicates that when receivers elaborate on a message, they are relying on central route processing. When they engage in little or no elaboration, they are using the peripheral route to persuasion. The processing route a receiver uses is largely dependent on his or her motivation and ability. There are several predictors of motivation, including personal involvement, which is the strongest predictor, ability, and the number of arguments in the message. The third theory we'll be looking at is the social judgment theory, or SJT. SJT examines the conditions that persuasive message receivers experience. The central contention of SJT is that relative to any issue, people have a position. This position is referred to as their attitudinal anchor, and it represents the perspective that the individual finds most acceptable on the issue. Researchers theorized that people typically have a range of attitudes rather than a single fixed point. The range of positions that a receiver finds acceptable is known as the latitude of acceptance. The latitude of rejection lies outside of the latitude of acceptance and includes all of the positions that the receiver finds unacceptable. The latitude of non-commitment represents the positions toward which a receiver is neutral or has no opinion at all. Persuaders must then determine just how much change to ask for without pushing the receiver outside of his or her latitude of acceptance. When persuaders push too hard and for too much change, the resulting effect will be that SJT refers to as the boomerang effect, an extreme form of resistance. In summary, the chapter provides a solid understanding of how persuasion is used in strategic communication to create messages that will influence target audiences to change their attitudes and behaviors relative to established objectives.